Let's see if I'm live. I do appear to be live. Welcome, everyone. You're watching episode 39, I believe, of my Android developer live stream Q&A. So, this is going to be kind of a tired and not well prepared episode because I am tired and not well prepared, but at the very least I do have a couple of things that I'll be talking about, and we will get to some Q&A pretty quickly. But yeah, before I get to that, I just wanted to mention a couple of things. So I'm just OCD fixing my sleeves here. So number one, I would just like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon. So that's going to include Seth Keegan. I'll just read the first names for now. Seth, Trevor, Bassam, Tina, Nanotech, A, Mr. Bidwell, Graham, Sushil, Elad, Shoku, Tomas, Juan, and Roni. So to all those people, I say thank you very much. I also did recently receive some support through PayPal as well, and I apologize I don't have your name handy, but yeah, next episode I will give you a shout out, whoever that was. So yeah, it's been a crazy time for me, and I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about why I wasn't able to stream last week. So the main thing is, as some of you, a select few of you might know, I'm in the process of moving. And so I had actually put in notice to leave my current apartment at the end of the previous month, which meant that I have to be out of this place by the end of March, which is the current month. And I didn't actually have a new place to live lined up right away. It was just kind of a situation where I needed to leave pretty quickly to avoid paying double rent. And so anyways, longer story shorter, up until Monday, last Monday, which is 5 or 6 days ago, I didn't actually have a place to live at the end of the month. So I wouldn't have been homeless because I can afford to stay at a hotel or whatever, but as you can imagine, I was a little bit stressed out. So that was number one reason why I didn't stream last week last weekend. I had to find a new place to live, so I hope you'll understand that was pretty important. And the other thing was that Saturday night, I have a new job. I won't talk too much about it, but I have a new job which fortunately pays pretty well. But the thing about this job is I was awake on the previous Saturday night until 4 a.m. Now the thing about that is when I do these live streams, I'm normally getting up at 4 a.m. or 4:30. So I wasn't even going to bed until the time I would normally get up to prepare for the whole live stream. So longer story shorter, I don't want to bore you with my personal problems, but I wasn't able to stream last weekend because of several problems, adjusting to a new job, finding a place to live. I will obviously stream today, and hopefully I'll be able to do the stream next week. However, in April, I'm not really sure what my streaming schedule will be because I'll be in a new apartment and I need to get my internet set up again and, you know, what have you. So, anyways, I'll keep everyone posted. And like I say, I know there are a couple people disappointed that I didn't do the stream last week, but hey, it is what it is. I do this stuff pretty much for free. Like there's the Patreon support, but yeah. Anyways, enough rambling there. Let me just check the chat here. So, looks like we have, that's a great question to start off with, so we'll check out that in a minute. What's up, everyone? So we've got Linksy, that's my channel, Krunal, Azem, Carol, and Mikolai. So to all these people, I say Privyet, do widzenia, or no, that's goodbye, Dzień dobry. Yeah, anyways, what's up, everybody? So the thing I wanted to talk about that's programming related at the start of this episode is I want to talk to you about Gradle a little bit and why it's been taking me so long to do the Kotlin ModelViewPresenter calculator app tutorial. So, oh good, it's actually going to show up first try this time. So I've been saying for weeks now that I'm basically done my Kotlin ModelViewPresenter clean architecture, blah, 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 demo application. So this is the application that I'll be using to teach a new tutorial series, which I'll be working on starting today, basically. And essentially what the application is, it's just a simple calculator app, but it's built really well. So one of the reasons why I wasn't able to actually get started working on the tutorials, aside from the fact that I've been trying to find a new place to live, is that I had one of the most ridiculous Gradle errors I've ever dealt with. And the thing about it is the app was complete, essentially, except Gradle wasn't building 100% properly. And so I decided, all right, well, since it's not working anyway, I'm going to redo how I build my Gradle setup. And so that will be kind of the lesson I give at the start here is A, where I went wrong, and B, a cool new way, not new, but a cool way to sort of set up your Gradle setup. So first and foremost, one of the most common ways, let's see if I can get that in the screen here. So I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but one of the most common ways to sort of set up your Gradle, how it's set up by default, is you have your project level build Gradle file here, and then you'll have your module level build Gradle file, which is of course in a module, and it's going to have this kind of stuff going on. And then of course you've got the settings.gradle, and settings.gradle is where you can basically set up different modules. And I've added a new file which is called versions.gradle. Now it doesn't need to explicitly be called versions.gradle, but essentially what this file is it's a separate file which our project level build Gradle will draw from. And so what it essentially draws, or grabs, whatever word you want to use, it basically grabs all these different definitions here. So really quickly, this is maybe some useful stuff for people who are new to Gradle or sort of groovy syntax and stuff like that. So first and foremost, probably most of you at some point have seen this ext dot something or other. You'll see like just ext, or maybe in some people, in older apps, what I've done is within the project level build Gradle file, I'll create a little, again, I forget if this is called this should be a script, which gets turned into a task. But you can create this little, I'll just call it a code block here, and you can make variables like whatever variable equals something. So for the longest time I was kind of wondering, like, so what exactly is ext? Well, it essentially, what it is it refers to these things called extension properties, if I'm not getting that wrong. And so you're going to want to look that up in the Gradle documentation. But essentially, extension properties, how you can think of this is your Gradle project. Your project, when configured with Gradle, has an object. I forget exactly what it's called. I think the object itself is called project. And essentially ext is like a way to add extra data to your project in kind of a quick and easy way. Go and look up extension properties. But essentially we're basically just like adding extra data to our Gradle project. So it's not witchcraft, it's not something really crazy, it's really just a way to create extra variables of data. Now there's another way you can create variables in Groovy. I'm really not an expert in Groovy, but you can also use this def keyword, and def is very similar to like say var in Kotlin, or in this case in Java you would have to write this in a very verbose way, but to translate this line of code into Java it would be something of the order of it's been a while since I've written much Java because I've been in Kotlin, but it would be say collection versions equals new collection, or something like that. And this symbol down here just means like a map collection object, I believe. I think it's a map, key value pairs. Blah, 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 it doesn't really matter. So what did I do wrong? So I called this thing here ext.deps, which is basically the way that I get a hook to this variable, all these variables and all this data in this file. I called it dependencies, like that. Now the problem with doing that, as I didn't realize, is that dependencies is basically a reserved sort of property for any Gradle project. So the problem with doing that, and I didn't realize that at the time, I didn't know dependencies was not a variable you should be sort of trying to overwrite. It doesn't work very well. And longer story shorter, I spent like 4 days, not full days, but the little bit of programming time I had over a long and annoying process of looking for an apartment, 4 days were lost just trying to figure out why the hell I couldn't get build Gradle to work, or I couldn't get my Gradle project to build. Longer story shorter, this was the reason why. I had called this thing dependencies, and you can't actually call it that because that's like a reserved sort of word. It's like, let me just see if I can pull up the Gradle documentation really quickly, because that will clear what I'm talking about up a little bit. And then we'll get to some Q&A in a moment here. Just give me one moment. Let me just see if I can find Gradle. Let's say Gradle extension properties and blah blah blah. All right, so just so everyone's kind of on the same page here before I move on. So you're going to want to check this out if you're not sure what this ext thing is that keeps popping up in a lot of different Gradle files. This ext essentially refers to a project object here. It's like shorthand for project.ext, and this project object is something that Gradle gives you automatically when you create your project. So I want you to think of it like project is an object similar to like Java or Kotlin, which represents your project, and ext is like extra properties or extension values or whatever. So anyways, longer story shorter, I forget why I brought this up other than to say ext, but what was happening is there's already, as far as I'm aware, there's already I don't know if I'll be able to find the thing, dependencies. For this project object, I believe there's already a project.dependencies property, and I was overwriting that, and as a result, I wasn't able to build my Gradle project, even though it was basically all done, and that's another reason why it's been taking so long to do that tutorial project. Anyways, that's all fixed now. The project has been updated. You link it in the description box down below, and it's working. So yeah, anyways, on to Q&A. I can tell I'm rambling quite a bit today. So hopefully that was mildly interesting for everyone. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare for this episode either, so it is what it is, but hopefully I can at least answer some questions. All right. So first question of the day comes from That's My Channel. I'm just writing the first name, and as far as I'm concerned, your first name is That's. And so That's asks, excuse me. So ModelViewPresenter versus ModelViewController versus ModelViewViewController for beginners or as a beginner. So what I'm basically drawing from this question, I think there was a follow-up. Oh, yeah, just had a separate question. Okay. So, first and foremost, what are these three things? We'll start there. So, number one, we're talking about ModelViewPresenter. We're talking about ModelViewController. There is a dash in there, Ryan. Model view controller. Then we're talking about model view model. And I forgot the dash again. Okay, here we go. So I just wanted to write these out. So for anyone who's not familiar with these little abbreviations, I think most of you probably are, but you probably want to know, okay, what do these things mean? And what I'm drawing from this question is essentially, I'm a beginner, what should I learn first? And maybe I can touch on what are the actual differences between these three things. So before I go into comparing them individually, I have an article which I called, what did I call it? Just one moment here. I have an article which basically addresses this quite directly. So I will answer the question, but let me also share the article. So this is the, I'll post it in the chat, but if you're curious, I wrote a blog called Passive View and SOC. I'm not in text view mode. There we are. So yeah, I wrote a big article. It's called WTF Does ModelViewPresenter Actually Mean? And I actually talk about the different architectures, and I address this question that you're asking. So anyways, just a heads up, it's either in the description box below, or you can find my website definitely in the description box below there. Sorry, my speaking is not very fluid today for whatever reason, so apologies about that. Anyways, so first and foremost, the primary difference between these three things is, just for starters, let's take a moment to realize that we have three things that are kind of called architectures or styles or patterns. I'll call these architectures. So we have three different architectures. They all have a model, and so model I want you to think of as data. They all have a view, and I want you to think of as view as basically user interface. Essentially, I'm simplifying it a little bit to make it easier, but that's essentially it. And then what we get into are the thinking parts of these architectures. So whether it's the presenter or the controller or the view model to less of a degree, this one's very ambiguous, and that this one here is ambiguous, and that affects my answer. These are essentially like logic. Essentially what I'm getting at here is, regardless of what style of architecture you use, and largely regardless of the project itself, you're going to want to separate data concerns, user interface concerns, and sort of the thinking part of the application. And generally the logic part, which is going to be the presenter or the controller or the view model, again, view model kind of, it's going to be the part that talks to the data source and then gives that data to the view. So what I've attempted to do there is just in a couple of minutes summarize what all three of these architectures are. Oh, it does have two L's, sorry. That looked wrong for a minute there. Yeah, so just to, yeah, that's basically to bring people up to speed. That's fundamentally what these things are. They're a separation of three concerns or three responsibilities, or I can't use that word anymore. They're a separation of concerns is what we'll call it. And those concerns are generally data, user interface stuff, and logic to coordinate those two things. So that's part one. Now, part two is what would I suggest for a beginner? It's a difficult scenario. So I'll start with the answer. My answer, generally speaking, if you're an Android developer, you're working in Java, I generally suggest you go with ModelViewPresenter. Now, it's very difficult to say concrete things about these architectures, and the reason why is that, well, there's several reasons. Number one, how one developer builds a ModelViewPresenter architecture is going to be different from how another developer might build it to subtle degrees, and these subtle little changes can be big. So what I'm trying to say is, what is actually behind the word ModelViewPresenter is not actually a super concrete thing. There are rules you'll follow and naming conventions, but what I'm trying to say is there's different ways to do ModelViewPresenter. The way that I do it and what I suggest for people is do ModelViewPresenter and passive view, which is kind of like a sub category of ModelViewPresenter, depending on who you ask. It really depends on the developer. Essentially, ModelViewPresenter, let's get away from the 3-layer architecture stuff. So ModelViewPresenter, essentially how it works, actually no, I won't break down it entirely. You just want to know what you should learn as a beginner. So I would suggest ModelViewPresenter because it's quite unambiguous. We already talked about model and view. They're pretty self-explanatory. Model is data management stuff. View is graphics, user interface kind of stuff. Presenter, the way I think of a presenter, and we can get us into some code now. Let's go to Kotlin calculator here. Link available in the description box below to the code. And when I navigate to calculator presenter, essentially what this presenter does is you'll see we have a view and a view model. Ignore that, it's not ModelViewModel architecture. This is just part of the model. Just think this is the view, this is the model, and this is another part of the model here, this evaluate expression. So the presenter, I know I'm teaching this and I said I wouldn't, but the presenter, why it's unambiguous is that it's called presenter. So it takes input from data, or it takes events from the user interface and it coordinates them. It presents things to it's like a file sorter. Oh, here's an event. What do I do with this event? Here, data, store this data, or model, store the data. So why I like ModelViewPresenter for beginners is because it's pretty unambiguous. ModelViewController, well, I'm going to be perfectly honest. The actual difference between ModelViewPresenter, let me rephrase that. The difference between a lot of ModelViewPresenter implementations I see and a lot of ModelViewController implementations I see is that it's really the same separation of concerns. Controller is very similar to presenter. One of the only distinguishing characteristics I could see is it generally appears that presenters are like feature level controllers, whereas a controller is like a huge object that knows a little bit about a lot of different views and a lot of stuff. Whereas with ModelViewPresenter, it's like, okay, let's say we have two features of the app. We have like display notes, or we have list of notes, and then we have like create note, and those are two features. So you'll have like display list presenter, and you'll have display list, sorry, you'll have view note presenter. So two features, two presenters. Whereas from what I've seen with ModelViewController, often the controller kind of knows a bit about lots of features. That's not necessarily for certain, and again, there's a lot of confusion here between everyone. It's really quite annoying, to be honest. So anyways, ModelViewController is pretty similar fundamentally. For Android, it's quite popular to use either ModelViewPresenter or ModelViewModel. Let me talk briefly about ModelViewModel. So MVVM is quite popular nowadays, and there's different reasons for that. And if you're going to pick something else for Android, it would be ModelViewModel. You're going to want to pick either of these two. I would suggest ModelViewPresenter as a beginner. Why? ModelViewModel is, of the architectures I've seen, the least consistently defined architecture. And my theory as to why it's so poorly defined is really the root of this thing right here, which is ViewModel. So the thing about this word ViewModel is essentially we're implying a model or object which represents the view. So that's what I read from ViewModel. Now, that's not actually what ViewModel is in the majority of ModelViewModel implementations that I've seen. What it actually is, in my opinion, if I were to get really nitpicky, is that it's more like a ViewModel controller. So it kind of does that often, but it's also kind of a controller for the view. Now, I don't really like that, and there's different ways to solve this problem. You can say ViewModel view controller, which actually looks a lot like what I do in Kotlin Calculator, which is, it is ModelViewPresenter here, but I also have a view model. Except this thing that I call a view model doesn't really make a lot of decisions. Whereas if you don't have a presenter or a controller of any kind, your view model tends to become an object which kind of does too many things. A lot of from what I've seen. Now, you can do ModelViewModel properly, and there are benefits to it. Like, the key feature with ModelViewModel is that view models don't depend on specific views. That's, in a nutshell, that's really the big selling point behind ViewModel. Whereas in ModelViewPresenter, the view does talk to the presenter, and the presenter does talk to the view. In ModelViewModel, the view talks to the view model, but the view model simply exposes data to observers. It uses the observer pattern. So essentially, ModelViewModel decouples views, and there are benefits to doing that. But I'm going to wrap this up by saying, listen, if you're a beginner, I really actually don't suggest you go with ModelViewModel. Later on, look into it, understand why it might be useful to have an object called ViewModel. Understand why it might be useful to have the view not necessarily depend on something like a presenter. But for ambiguity's sake, when I researched ModelViewModel, I saw as many different ways to build it and as many different interpretations of the word ViewModel as I saw different developers, different projects. So that's my answer there. Anyways, I'm just going to run a quick commercial break. If you've liked the show so far, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. All right. So that was number one. I've got 2 requests for this question. Oh, sorry, the ad is still running. Okay, so I have 2 requests for this question, so I better answer it. Now, it's going to be a little bit... I'm probably not going to give you the answer you might think I'll give you, but I'll at least explain my thoughts on this. And who is this? Oh no! I'm an idiot. Sorry, I just accidentally X'd out my live stream dashboard. That was stupid. I hope it actually saved the conversation. Good, it did. Okay. Sorry about that. I was just trying to find your name. So, Mr. That's also asked this question. I had 2 requests for this question, back to back. Okay, so the question is, should I go with RxJava or SyncTask? So, I'm going to start by saying that essentially what this question is asking is, you're asking to cut down a tree, should I use a hatchet or a chainsaw? So, and I know this might sound like a weird answer, but I think you'll understand what I'm getting at in a minute. So, check if you're an ESL person, please Google these 2 things, hatchet and chainsaw. So a hatchet is like an axe. You chop down a tree. I'm Canadian. We cut down trees. It's a common thing. I cut down trees. I ate my lunch. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. Monty Python reference. Or a chainsaw. So a hatchet is like a tool you use to chop down a tree. A chainsaw is like a machine that you can cut through lots of trees in like minutes. I've actually worked a chainsaw before. It's quite fun, but it's also very dangerous when you're chopping down big trees because you can die pretty quickly if it lands on you. And anyways. So I wanted to start by saying, essentially we're talking, to use an analogy, SyncTask is kind of like the hatchet, and RxJava is kind of like the chainsaw. So why I'm saying that is, you're saying, should I go with RxJava or SyncTask? It's going to depend on what you need to do. So it's almost like the same tool, the same problem domain, cutting down trees, but one is like really, really powerful, and if you have like a complicated situation, you need to cut down 10 trees in, I don't know, 10 trees, that would probably take a whole day if you actually have to buck them up and trim the limbs and all that stuff. Whereas if you just have to like cut down a Christmas tree that's like, or cut a branch off, then you would probably just want to use the hatchet. I don't know, kind of a stupid analogy. Why do I say that? If you basically just want to do something on a background thread and call back to the main thread /UI thread, you can just use SyncTask or future, I think it's called. Or if you're from JavaScript, I think there's a thing called a promise. And essentially what that is, all of these things, it's very simple. SyncTask, do some task asynchronously in the background, call the result back on the main thread. So, calculator app, perform the calculation on the background, give the result back to the UI. RxJava, a lot more complicated. Let me pull up some slides really quickly here. So actually, before I continue, what I'm going to suggest to everyone, I have a video on my channel where I talk about RxJava, what it is and how powerful it is, and you're going to want to watch that video. It's one of the few videos I'm quite proud of. And what is it called? RxJava Observer Pattern on Steroids. Just as a funny side note, my this video got flagged and demonetized because of the word steroids. So nice going, YouTube. I appreciate you taking my money because, yeah, anyways. I think it's unflagged now, but just for the record, like, that's how insane YouTube is sometimes. Like, they literally block or demonetize the video because it had the word steroids in it. Anyways, whatever. RxJava. Let me pull up the slide. Sorry. That was kind of a random tangent. This could take a moment. I don't actually remember where my slides were for RxJava, but it'll be a better visual. Here we go. Okay. So hopefully I kind of described what SyncTask is. It's very simple. Why can't I change the slide? Here we go again with Windows 10's absolutely magical photo viewer. Come on now. Whatever. Okay. Okay, now it's working. So RxJava is a lot more complicated than just an async task. So when you want to actually basically compose asynchronous events from multiple different areas, something more complicated than just running a calculation or a download on the background thread, that's when you would want to get into using RxJava. RxJava is a lot more complicated. It can be. You can use RxJava as SyncTask. Like, you can basically do that, but if that's the only thing you use RxJava for, you're basically wasting a lot of potential firepower, I would say, for lack of a better word. RxJava is more complicated. It allows you to not only create these asynchronous sources that can work on the background, but you can compose streams together. You can change objects as they go through the asynchronous woodwork. How you can think of... Why can't I change the friggin... I just hate this, you know? I just want to be able to change the friggin' slide to the other picture in the friggin' file right here, but I can't do that. Here we go. I'm not actually mad, but... Okay, this is what RxJava is like, essentially. Go watch the video, I talk about it, but it's like this vacuum tube system. You can compose streams together from different areas, and let's get into code really briefly. Let's look at RxJava. So whereas I could have chosen to evaluate expressions, this is a calculator app, I could have chosen to evaluate expressions with async task. So this code here could be replaced with an async task. And so the async task would execute a calculation or an expression, and then it would kind of call back here for async task, it's on post execute is the callback method. And basically from there, I could essentially do the same thing. Why did I choose to use RxJava here? In this case, we call this object, we call evaluate.executeExpression. So evaluate is basically like a calculator. So we're saying backend, to go back to our pictures here, we're saying backend, perform this calculation. So if I go to this object, where is it? Oh. Essentially what this object does is it coordinates two different backend streams. So there's a validator and a calculator, and RxJava allows me to wait for the result of the validator, because I want to validate an expression first before I give it to a calculator, because if the expression is invalid, I can't calculate it anyway, so it's not even worth trying to calculate. So essentially what I do is I validate it first, and then I say to the calculator if it validates properly. This is actually synchronous. I don't even have to run this on the background. But if it validates, then we execute the calculator on the background. And this flat map thing here is just like a way. Flat map right here is essentially this transformation right here. So we have an object of one type, that comes into the flat map and gets transformed into a different kind of object before it propagates to the front end. So anyways, I'm going to stop talking about that because you need to go watch my video where I talk about the whole thing. So to get back to the question, if I can find it, the question was like where was the question? RxJava or SyncTask? Listen, I would suggest RxJava is a much more complex tool, which is harder to learn, but gives you a lot of power. SyncTask is a super simple tool which doesn't give you nearly as much power. So like one of the things with SyncTask is, let's say you wanted to like combine multiple events. If you want to do that with SyncTask, you get like all this fucked up, pardon me, sorry, I didn't mean to swear, all this screwed up callback stuff, and it's just really ugly. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you just need one operation to execute on the background, like downloading a photo or something really simple, use SyncTask probably. However, I highly suggest everyone learns RxJava or some kind of reactive library. I can almost guarantee you that that will be very important for the future, to know a little bit about functional programming and reactive programming. So that's basically my answer there. Hopefully that's useful. All right, what else have we got here? Oh, and that's my channel. Follows up with the question, resource for RxJava. You should watch my video on RxJava, because I actually think I did a pretty good job of explaining it. It's very hard to explain what RxJava is. It's hard to explain what it is without leaving out so much, because you can kind of call RxJava an implementation of the observer pattern, which is what I talk about in the video, is that it is really the observer pattern. However, it's a lot more than that, so that's why I said on steroids. But it's very difficult to kind of talk about. Anyways, let's get to my questions. All right, what do we got here? On what layer? I can maybe riff on that a bit. I will try, anyways. So this question is from Joshua. On what layer do you handle stuff like disable button if input is empty, or set error if text field is empty? So again, this is something that's going to change a little bit depending on what your architecture is. So let me explain how I would think about this and approach this. So I wouldn't handle any kind of logic like this in the view. That would be the kind of thing where I would have my presenter make the actual decision about what goes on. So if I were to actually rename the presenter, I would call it the front-end decision maker. Speaking of ModelViewPresenter, which is a front-end architecture, I would handle that in the presenter. Now, one thing that is one of the issues with three-layer architectures is I might also store that kind of data in something like a ViewModel. But again, we're not talking MVVM ViewModel. I'm talking a definition of ViewModel which makes sense, which is something that models the view but isn't the view. So it stores the data for the view temporarily. So that'd be the kind of thing you could also maybe, you could store those flags, those booleans, maybe in this view model. Ultimately, what I would suggest to you is don't handle that in the view. Have that as something that another object tells the view. More and more, I see the value in the view being kept really dumb. It shouldn't have logic, really at all. Conversely, the presenter shouldn't have state. I feel like I'm Donald Trump with these hand gestures. Huge. Sorry. I won't give my opinion on that person, but just as a quick, I've been very hand gestury today. I use my hands to show confidence and openness, even though, yeah, anyways, whatever. You can tell I'm tired today. The presenter doesn't store state is a key point. So in that particular case, those are like kind of the two iron rules that I really follow here. View should not make logical decisions. So by that logic, I just accidentally opened Spotify. By that logic, to answer your question, I would not handle this in the view. I would probably handle that in the presenter. Now, I might store a representation of this in a separate view model, or you could call it view model, you could call it UI model, presentation model, whatever. Basically, a representation of the front end's current state / data. You could store it somewhere there, but what the actual logic is, I would make that decision in the presenter or the controller, to answer your question, hopefully. Sorry, that one was a little all over the place, but again, it's hard to say really concrete things without already having your architecture laid out, and you've already said my presenter is going to do this, my view is going to do this, blah blah blah. So without that, it's hard to say which layer specifically. Hopefully that was useful anyways. All right. I always like that. So Ryan Brown is mentioning, why do I always say longer story shorter? Apparently, it's actually, according to Ryan Brown, the expression is long story short. So I actually don't agree with you, Ryan Brown, that I should speak in proper English. And honestly, we're debating an expression which doesn't really have an objective definition or objective usage. So fair enough. I will continue to say longer story shorter, whether that irritates you or not. I don't really care. Anyways, the grammar Nazis are about. I always find that funny when people like argue about certain expressions and English language and all that stuff, because it's so irregular and subjective to begin with that it's funny to me. Anyways, what else have we got? I've got a lot of questions here, so just give me a moment to have a quick look through. A lot of questions. Okay, let's see. I have so many questions, I'm not even sure which one to pick here. Okay, just give me like 1 sec. I'm just going to run a quick commercial break, and then hopefully by the end of that I'll have figured out which question, because there's just a lot of good questions. I'm not going to answer your question, Carol. You have a question about ModelViewModel. MVVM is really not my preferred architecture, so I see that you've asked the question, but I wouldn't really, yeah, I wouldn't really use ModelViewModel. I don't really use it, so I'm probably not the best person to talk about it. I like this question. I'll get to this question. And you have one of the most interesting names I've ever seen, which looks vaguely Eastern European. If you can, let me know where you're from. Yeah, I don't, Nizam John. That's an interesting name. I'm always curious about where people are from. Okay, I won't actually answer your question right away. There's one more follow-up that I want to get to first. Okay, let me just deal with this follow-up. So this is a follow-up to the question I just answered here. And this was by... So this is from Linksy, just following up from my talk about the presentation model. So Linksy asks, won't that mean that the presenter becomes a clusterfuck? His words, not mine, or her words, I'm assuming his. So the presenter handles all the UI logic and deals with communication to the service layer. So yes, you're absolutely... you're not... I understand what you're saying. So in a word, yes. That is essentially what my presenters have become. They are sort of like stateless managers of input from basically 3 places. The first input source is the user interface touch events, or just UI events. So it'll manage those. There are back-end communication to the service layer, like you said, so it'll handle that. And then the third thing, which I've added recently, is that the presenter also talks to a ViewModel. And the ViewModel is like a front-end data source, essentially. So a normal flow of my presenters is, let's say the user inputs an expression into the calculator app. So that'll go from the view to the presenter as like a evaluate this expression event. So the presenter will take that event, hand it to the back end, and wait for the back end to call back. Once the back end calls back, it'll take that result, look at it, and basically give that to the ViewModel. So when the ViewModel updates, and this was actually a suggestion by my friend Dogal Bitsy, when the ViewModel updates, it exposes that data back to the presenter, which takes some of the logic out of the presenter and makes that a bit easier. And then the presenter, when it gets that data, it just looks at it and gives it to the view. So you're right in the sense that the presenter has quite a bit going on. The thing about it, though, is that what I'm really trying to do with my presenters is I'm trying to capture as much of the front-end logic as possible. So I'm essentially trying to create things which will talk to as many different sources, back-end, front-end, whatever, as it needs to, and I want to be able to cover all of those different events with unit tests. So yes, in a very large application, the presenter could get quite complicated, but as long as you're actually like really modularizing your project, so you're not having like one feature for the whole thing, like I'll do, like I really separate my projects to avoid having huge presenters and stuff. As long as you're doing that, I don't actually mind having the presenter handle almost all of the logic of the front end. So you're right in the sense that it, yeah, in a way, I'm making the presenter... What I would say is this is what I actually think the presenter should do. I don't think it should ever store state at all. What I think it should do is simply... The presenter is the thing that sits in the middle of the room and passes messages and decides what to do. And by that kind of definition, that's why I don't mind having maybe a slightly more complicated presenter, as long as I test it well. All right, so that was that kind of follow-up question. Not sure how useful that random babble was, but this was a good... Linksy brought up a good point, which is that in my interpretation of presenter, it could be complicated, but it does not become a clusterfuck. And the reason why is I cover all of the different things that the presenter does with unit tests. There was another... really quickly, before I get to Nizam John's question, just really quickly, there was a question, is RxJava harder to test than SyncTask? And I don't have your name right away, but just to answer this really quickly, not in my opinion. The way that you test RxJava really easily, well, it's all relative, and you can check out Kotlin calculator, link in the description box below. The way that you can test it pretty easily is you can use this thing called a test. You can use test scheduler, and where is it? Is it not this one? Evaluate expression. Where the hell is it? I think this thing got renamed to something wrong. Yeah, this thing got renamed to something improper. This should just be... I gotta change that. I know what happened. Yeah, that should just be called evaluate expression test. I'll fix that later. I was refactoring a bunch of stuff and it looks like I accidentally renamed that. Anyway, so the way that you test RxJava pretty easily is you want to use this test subscriber, which I created up here. And what the test subscriber does is it acts like an endpoint. It acts like a subscriber, and then down here you can just check what happens. You can check what the subscriber was given. So here I'm just double checking, make sure that this value, so subscriber.values is like get the value out of the subscriber and then assert what it is. So just a quick little hint here, that's how you can test RxJava really easily. Use test subscriber. Anyways, back to the other thing. That was just a really quick thing. I didn't want to spend too much time. Okay, let's get to this question here. Okay. So we're going to talk about clean architecture for a moment. So Nizam John's question is, can I talk about data, domain, and presentation layers in clean architecture? So this is such a huge topic that I'm not even sure where I'll go, but at the very least, let me kind of explain what those three are and the peculiar thing that they also kind of pop up in other areas, which sounds weird. So data, domain, and presentation are a separation of concerns based on three things. And I'm going to give my own definitions of these things. You might also, if you're curious for resources, Robert C. Martin and Martin Fowler, off the top of my head. There's also, let me just double, Fernando Cejas, I think. Let me just make sure I'm not confusing. Yes. I just want to give props to this fellow here as well. This is Fernando Cejas, I believe is how you would pronounce that roughly. And he has some really good code on clean architecture. So I just want to give everyone a shout out. Now, like he talks about these 3 layers here, if you're curious. So his GitHub is Android 10. And that was kind of my early introduction to clean architecture. Now, I talk about it differently a little bit. My job, the thing that I always try and do is I try not to explain these things in a super technical way. So data should be thought of as back-end implementation. I don't know how I'm going to get through this because I might have to cover a lot of ground in a very short time. So I'll try. Data should be thought of as like back-end implementation. Domain should be thought of as high level, meaning abstract, descriptions of what your app's data and operations should look like. If to rephrase, abstract descriptions of the problem domain. This is kind of where that word comes from, and when we say problem domain, a problem domain is like the data necessary for a given application and the things it needs to do. It's very hard to talk about this in a brief time period. I normally would want to spend like a half hour describing each of these things, but yeah, so the problem domain is like kind of a high level description, but in a way it's also a middle person between the data and the presentation. So it's like high level and kind of vague, but also it separates the 2 implementation layers. Presentation is just UI. Now, the thing about it is that let me go back to something I wrote earlier. Notice how up here, when I was talking about ModelViewPresenter up here, I talked about data, logic, and user interface. And these are almost analogous to data, domain, and presentation, whereas domain would kind of be the logic, but domain's a little more than that. But this is a similar separation of concerns. It's just that in terms of presentation, ModelViewPresenter would be my presentation layer. Now that might confuse a few people, because the difference is when we're getting to clean architecture, we don't just think of presentation as the view. Presentation is like the whole front end, essentially. The implementation of the front end. Whereas the domain is kind of, it's so hard to talk about. It's abstract. And it's hard to talk about that with a quick analogy. And my brain's not very sharp today. Yeah. Let me go to a picture and then we'll move on to something else, because that's really I'm struggling to think of a different way to approach this that really gives you the whole picture, but hopefully I touched on a couple things. To finish this off, let me talk about this. I bring this diagram up quite a bit. So again, when we see this, I could actually add another slash here, /domain. Use case /interactor, this is domain, essentially. Domain's a little more than that, but yeah. So these are these 3 clean architecture layers again. And as you can see, so view and presentation contains fragment and presenter, so view and presenter, and also that view model would sit here. Use case slash interactor slash domain, this area here, we would have use cases, but I would also want things called entities or domain models. If I go to my code here, I know it's hard to see, but think of this package domain as like a miniature version of a domain layer, and it contains domain models. It contains descriptions of what should go in the data layer called repositories, and it contains these use cases. So these are all high-level abstract things, and then the data layer is an implementation of these high-level repositories. Sorry, excuse me. And the view and the presenter in that talk to the domain, and the domain hides all of this backend stuff from the view. So to wrap things up, from a 1,000-foot view, presentation, domain, and data are a separation of concerns, and the data layer is stuff that the presentation layer shouldn't know about, but the application needs to actually save data or to actually send a network call or to actually do that. The middle layer is domain. It contains high-level models and use cases and definitions and high-level logic, business logic, I think it's called. Or is that, I don't know, I always get confused which is business logic and app logic because it just vague definitions. And then presentation is going to be front-end, Android, ModelViewPresenter kind of stuff. And hopefully that answers your question somewhat. All right. That was a mouthful. Yep. So we have, there's a bit of back and forth about my usage of the English language, and I have someone telling me that objective standard and my usage is incorrect, and there is an objective standard for English expressions. So respectfully, I don't agree with you, but yeah, fair enough. I think we should just move on, Ryan. The person's name is Ryan, by the way. Okay. FD Hockey just wanted to say thank you for the videos and that my videos are helping. You're very welcome. I'm glad you enjoy them. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to call it a day for here, but just to reiterate a couple of things, like I absolutely agree with Nikolai here that when we're talking about clean architecture, the most fundamental thing we want to deal with here is ultimately it's about separation of concerns, and the main three concerns you're thinking about will be data, UI, and like high-level abstractions of what your app needs to do and what kind of data it needs to represent. And that's a huge mouthful, and it's kind of difficult to explain, but when we're thinking clean architecture, however you actually do it, just think about separating logic, data, and stuff that draws things on the screen, and that's the fundamental core there. So, anyways. Krunel, just really quickly, Krunel asked something about a slow recycler view with bitmap images. So Cornell, I have to ask, are you using a library to load the bitmaps into the recycler view? And are you loading them asynchronously? Because what I would suggest you do is, if you're using Glide or Picasso, you can have a little callback in the view to basically change the state of the recycler view items. I need to figure out how to do this in a more separation of concerns way, but for each sort of view holder item, you can set up a callback when you load the image into the recycler view item, and so you display a loading screen as the image is loading, and once Picasso or Glide calls back to say that it's done, then you change the visibility of a loading bar or whatever to the image that's now loaded. And so as the user is scrolling through your recycler view, they'll see not just blank, they won't just see blank items, they'll see a loading bar until the bitmap or whatever loads. Now maybe you're using Picasso or Glide. I would actually suggest Glide, an image loading library. So maybe you're using that and you still have issues, but just for a quick little thing here. Anyways, I don't really have time for a memory leak discussion here. Sorry. Okay, I had a request to address the topic of interfaces, so I think I'll do that and then we'll call that a day. Let me see if I can find your question. Okay. Let me see if I can parse this question here. From Mikolai. Okay. So, referring to the calculator app. So in the calculator app, I've created interface class listing sub-interfaces. So that would be iViewContract here. But I also declared an interface and calculation model class. Calculation model class. Why are some interfaces declared outside the contract? I think I'm going to answer what I think your question is, but I might get this slightly wrong. And just give me one moment here. The sun's kind of in my eyes now. Let's get some mood lighting going. There we go. That's a little better. I could barely see my screen. So, I believe what Mikolai is talking about here is, so again, we're looking at the ModelViewPresenter Kotlin calculator project. So for the front end of this application, for the front end, to describe kind of the whole ModelViewPresenter front end, which in my style does kind of include a ViewModel, although again, I say this every time, we're not talking about ModelViewModel here. Really just think of this as another part of the model, and then we're all happy. ModelViewPresenter. What I do is, so for a front end feature, I've just kind of gotten in the habit of basically putting all of these things in one sort of file, which is on one level not really separation of concerns. The reason why I do this is because I like having this one file for each feature, which kind of talks about all the different things that each of these ModelViewPresenter components need to do. So I like to have all of this in one file. Now I believe what you're talking about, and yeah, like you don't necessarily need to do this. The reason why I do this is basically for organizational purposes, honestly. It's not anything really special. Then if I go to the domain layer, we have this separated out interface. So we've got like iCalculator, which is the interface for my calculator implementation. And then iValidator, which is the interface for the validation kind of logic. So in this particular case, in the domain, I am going to want to observe the separation here. The validator, I could put this in, if I really wanted to, I could put this in like a sub interface thing again. Really, so what I would say regarding this question is normally I wouldn't combine interfaces, and I would try and apply what's called the interface segregation principle. In the particular scenario of where did it go? It's gone now. Of the front end, basically the interfaces that define the front end, I kind of like to have them all in one file just so I don't need to open multiple files at the same time. And it's kind of like having one thing I can look at quickly. And there's not really any major setback to doing this because all of these things live in the same spot. They'll live in the same sort of package. Well, more or less the same layer. And they're all closely related, so that's why I would kind of want to do this. And also the nice thing about it is, let's say I added another feature to this app, I would call the interface something else. So I might call it, I don't know, I don't know, let's say we added a feature to make our calculator app able to post to Facebook. We could call that like iFacebook view contract, and then I wouldn't actually need to change any of these things, because then to refer to it I would just say iFacebook contract dot view. So essentially, yeah, it's kind of just a way of saying my front end is almost always going to have like this ViewModel presenter division, and there's almost always going to be just this one file for each feature if I'm following ModelViewPresenter. And since they're inherently related, I find it a little more convenient to keep them all in the same file. So yeah, I might do that differently depending on, you know, what the situation is. Anyways, oh, that's basically it. Last little question. I just have this question from Ranjdar from Iraq, and the question is, where can you get more release quality source code with tutorials? So I don't, you know, for tutorials, here's the thing, I don't watch other YouTubers. I don't, because it's just, I don't really watch other people in the same business to avoid cross-contamination, and I don't actually want to learn Android, and I don't from other YouTube teachers. I actually tend to learn from open source code, and I'll watch conference videos and stuff like that. I need to do more of that. My biggest resource outside of what I do, honestly, is, let me just share them here. I know you're kind of looking for tutorials, but to be honest, something that's like even better than that, what I generally learn from anyways, are two main projects. So number one, this is in the Google Samples repository, so this is official, and it's called Android Architecture Blueprints. And so it's a collection of applications, or I guess you could call it, hey, if my tutorials are release quality, these are release quality. Not all of my projects are release quality. Some of them are just designed as a tutorial. But if you want like really good code written by a lot of developers and Googlers and all kinds of stuff, definitely check out these projects and try and get used to learning from that instead of tutorials. But, you know, if you find someone who you like with the tutorials, by all means. I'm just not a good person to ask about that stuff because I make a point of not watching other YouTubers at this period, so I don't really know. And there's also Android Architecture Components samples. This one, Android Architecture Components. And this demonstrates a whole bunch of really good stuff. So these are like my sort of main short-term resources for learning Android-specific code. You can also check out Google's Code Labs, are amazing. I would also really like, here's an idea. When I was learning Room and Realm, and all, or sorry, not Realm, when I was learning Room and Architecture Components, all I needed was these Code Labs. I didn't have to watch any tutorials by some schmuck like me explaining the whole thing, although I do have a big tutorial on Architecture Components if you're curious, but all of what I learned was essentially from these Code Labs here. Yeah, like persistence code lab and all that stuff. So those are my main suggestions for free resources that contain good quality code. So that's going to be it. The last thing I'll do is, since this is episode 39, the next episode, which will hopefully air on next Sunday, will be the 40th episode. So if you're kind of new around here, every 10th episode of the live stream, I talk about something. I do kind of a borderline ask me anything episode, although I'm not necessarily saying I'm going to answer anything. But to give you an example, in the episode 30, I talked at length about productivity and diet and being healthy. And I generally kind of pick a main theme to talk about something that's still very practical, hopefully, but not necessarily directly related to programming. It's basically my excuse to just ramble every 10th episode about whatever the hell I want to ramble about. So I had a suggestion from one of my friends, actually, to talk about learning things and kind of learning in general. So I don't know exactly what I'll plan as the opening ramble session for that episode, but if you would ever like a time to ask me questions that aren't specifically about coding, it's every 10th episode, and my main topic will be centered around learning, and that is the place for a more off-topic session. So I know that isn't what everyone wants. A lot of people just want me to always talk about Android and answer their questions, but unfortunately for those people, I'm not your monkey. So if you don't like it, you can just wait for episode 41. So thank you so much for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. I'll say thank you in as many languages as I can recall at the moment. So merci beaucoup. Muchas gracias. Dziękuję. Spasibo. Kamsahamnida. Arigato. What else have we got? Tak. I think that's Swedish. Anything else? Shia. That's it. Okay, I give up. Thanks, everyone. Happy Sunday. Happy coding.